11 o'clock, eNCA comes to you live from Johannesburg. Good morning and thank you for joining us. I'm Thulasizwe Semelane. The ANC has announced its mayoral candidates for metros across the country. However, the Tshwane Metro candidate still has to be decided. The Northern Cape did not meet the deadline and has been given a week to do so. We'll discuss this further now with eNCA commentator Angelo Fick. Angelo, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Were you surprised by any of the additions or the omissions from the lists that were released very late into the night last night?
Yes, I suppose the African National Congress is trying to show us that they are indeed working hard by releasing this on a Saturday night, way after darkness has settled on the country. But my sense is surprises mostly by the omissions, not so much surprises in Nelson Mandela and Johannesburg. We knew that they had declared Danny Jordan late in the middle of last year as their mayoral candidate against Athol Trollip, and that Parkstow's record in Johannesburg was an indication that he would be kept and that the Gauteng provincial executive committee were probably going to push for him to be kept. Some changes in terms of what's going on around the country. Women candidates for Tshwane and Mangaung, which I think was the ANC's attempt to bring gender parity. They've indicated that in their statement. But also I think they're going to argue that they chose people based on their skill levels for particular posts in places like Ekurhuleni and in Cape Town.
Let's talk about Tshwane. Are you surprised at all that it's the one metro that is still outstanding, especially given what we've seen in the build-up to the announcement, the kind of differences that have been happening over the list processes, the protesting that has been taking place? It was only to be expected that it was always going to be difficult for consensus to be reached around Tshwane.
Yes, it surprised me that they, the ability to settle Tshwane but not settle Tshwane was for me a bit of a surprise there. But I suspect that that will have to work itself out, because that will also be an indication of other areas, not in the big cities, where those lists have been matters of contention and where the candidates will still have to be finalised. The Tshwane settlement, of course, on the candidate who is the chair of the Tshwane region is, I think, a process that would have begun in December of last year. But the internal issues that have been going on inside Tshwane, I think, may explain some of why that has not been reached. That has not reached a conclusion. But it's important, given that this is the nation's capital, this is the administrative capital of the country, for the ANC to settle that as soon as possible. Because the closer we get to the voting deadline, if they settle it in a way that still causes unhappiness, and we will see over the next week how many of these appointments cause some concern at branch level and below among ordinary voters, people who live in wards and aren't necessarily members of branches, that will work itself out. But if it is Tshwane and this continues to closer onto the election, there may be a problem for the African National Congress.
And of course, the National Executive Committee of the ANC this morning going back to Tshwane to engage with the region, but also the branches. Let's talk briefly about eThekwini. Zandile Gumede now being proposed as the mayoral candidate. This means an end for James Nxumalo. Is this a case of winner takes all that we have come to see following contested electoral conferences of the ANC?
It's partly that, but partly also it's the manoeuvring towards 2017, because people who are working hard on the ground towards a certain or a particular section's ambitions in 2017 will have to be rewarded now so that they're in key positions. We've seen that in changes in the provincial government. We're now going to see it in the local government elections. And of course, this will not necessarily end at the appointment of a candidate and that candidate's election to the position of mayor come August 4, August 5, when the results are in. It will continue in the wake of that into the 18 months till December 2017, when we have that succession debate coming out, and people on the ground will have to manoeuvre in order to get the candidate of their choice placed in 2017.
Does that line of thinking, did you follow the same line of thinking about the candidate, for instance, for Ekurhuleni, Mzwandile Masina, who, I mean, in a province that was, not so enthusiastic in its support for President Jacob Zuma, and particularly over this period where it was being debated whether President Jacob Zuma should be asked to step down or not. And we did hear that he was very firmly in the corner of President Jacob Zuma. Does the same line of thinking that the national affecting the local, does it apply here?
It probably does, and in multiple ways. So there's that narrative of having to place somebody in the space who is seen to be favourable to a certain kind of national government at the certain moment, and government in the ANC, not necessarily government of the country. But also I think it could be seen as rapprochement, as an ability or a willingness for people to give and take. So this is realpolitik playing out itself, that you've got to trade some to win some. So you'll allow a candidate in who is seen not to be part of what we would be called a cabal, in order for you to deny that there is such a cabal, that this is simply democracy bottom up. But what we're also seeing here is that tension inside the ANC between bottom up democracy, people in branches voting for, choosing certain kinds of people inside structures, and top down vanguardist politics where leadership gets to vet what those lists look like in order to advance the parties and governments and what it sees as the people's interest more generally. And that's necessarily the case across the world. But how that happens in South Africa a year before a succession debate in the governing party can never be discounted, because while there's bottom-up and top-down structures, there's also the horizontal move of time to 2017 that these manoeuvres on the ground inside the African National Congress are all party to.
How does the ANC resolve this issue, Angelo? Why should the electoral processes, whether be it in the internal dynamics of the party in terms of leadership at various levels of the party, but also in terms of who gets deployed to government, why should they be so contentious and at times, result in the kind of violence that we have seen over the past few weeks, including the latest report that we heard on Friday coming out of Nelson Mandela Bay, where the top candidate for a ward councilor position was actually attacked, being the latest among the various incidents we have seen. How does the ANC balance that top-down approach with the bottom-up approach that it aspires to?
Well, partly the problem is that in its liberation movement phase, much of that had to do with strategy and had to do with ideological distinctions between various factions in the ANC. So the Marxists versus the Trotskyites, the capitalists versus the socialists. In its government phase, of course, what came into being was what Ibrahim Fakir and other political analysts have called the factions of the purse, which is that there are actually things to be had, material resources to be gained from being in government, and control over those particular resources means you can trickle it down in a patronage system. So this conflict between the democratic state and the patronage state is what we're seeing here as the ANC's big struggle in its second, in this moment, in its third decade in power. So after 22 years, it is precisely that having to reward people for their political work and having to use the state processes in order to effect those rewards is what the tension is here. So there are people on the ground who prefer a particular candidate, and there are people in government who actually have to reward somebody who is in that same space for work that they've done for the party. And this is a global phenomenon. We see this in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, we see it in the Republican and the Democratic parties in the United States, we see it play out across the world, that people who work hard for the party to effect certain kinds of outcomes have to be rewarded with political positions. And here the ANC's complication is not only is it this vanguardist top-down leadership and bottom-up democratic structure, it also has to play the long game of having to reward people for their work inside the party. And
what further complicates matters is the kind of contestation we are expecting, just how closely contested some of these metros are. I mean, yesterday you did hear the name of Thoko Didiza, for example, being mentioned, and that sort of suggested a kind of approach that would have been similar to what we saw in Nelson Mandela Bay, where someone who's not necessarily in that space of the local politics is being brought in because of their profile and experience.
Yes, and that's also because voters have to go to the polls for the party. So it is a gamble, and not in the sense of a silly game, but a serious gamble. If you choose candidate A, who happens to be supported by half of the people in the ANC in Tshwane, or candidate B by the other half, you end up running the risk of having the one half stay away because the candidate isn't the preferred candidate. Catapulting in or parachuting in a third candidate who is the preference of neither but has a national profile might resolve that problem, and you'll get a substantial proportion from each of those two camps voting for that candidate. But that, of course, requires of you to reward both of those remaining candidates, A and B, who are the internal candidates, without some other kind of reward, because their people still need to see that their candidates have not been sidelined and left out of any kind of structure altogether.
Just finally, can the ANC then move beyond this phase of contesting for who's going to be the ward councillor, who's going to be the mayoral candidate, and actually pull itself together, especially given that the stakes are this high before August the 3rd?
Well, that is the challenge, and I think it's a challenge for the voters. So those people who are at the moment undecided, and from the polls on Wednesday we know in Tshwane that that's quite a substantial proportion. About a fifth of potential voters in these polls have indicated that they're undecided or can't declare yet. And so those people need to be swayed, and they need to be swayed at the ward level by candidates that they can trust, believe in, and feel are not simply party apparatchiks. And at the mayoral level, they must have a candidate who speaks to the needs of the city and its citizens, not just to the needs of the party. And that's always a problem for any governing party, because its record is going to be its pride, what it can show that it has done, but also can be the space in which potential voters go, well, you didn't do X, Y, and Z. And any party in government runs that risk, that it alone has a record that can be poked at, and it alone has a record that it can stand on. And the ANC has that problem across this country. Like the DA in the Western Cape, it has the space in which its programs over the last 5 years of local government can be critiqued and become the basis for people walking away or walking towards.
eNCA commentator Angelo Fick, thank you so much for keeping an eye on that key story for